50 Famous Fairy Tales. Tale 24. Snow White. One day, in a winter, a certain queen sat by a window sewing. As she looked out of the snow, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell upon it. She gazed thoughtfully at the red drops and said, "I wish my little daughter may be as white as the snow, as red as blood, and as black as the ebony window frame." Not long after this, a baby was born to the queen, and the child's skin was as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. The queen called her Snow White. But sad to say, the queen became ill and died. The next year, the king married another woman who was very beautiful, but so proud and selfish that she could not bear to think of anyone in the world being more beautiful than herself. Her greatest treasure was a magic mirror in which she used to look and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" And the mirror would answer, "The magic mirror tells you true, the fairest in the land is you." As the years passed, Snow White grew more and more beautiful, and when she was 7 years old, she was fairer than the queen herself. Then one day, when the queen went to consult the mirror as usual, it answered, "The magic mirror tells you true, Snow White is lovelier than you." When the queen heard this, she turned pale with rage and envy. Calling a huntsman to her, she said, "Take Snow White into the forest and kill her, and bring her heart back to me." The huntsman took Snow White into the forest, but when he lifted his sword to kill her, she begged him so sweetly to spare her life that he could not bear to touch her. "I cannot hurt you, pretty child," he said, "but neither can I take you back, for the queen will kill us both." So he left her in the forest, and he killed a deer and took the deer's heart to the cruel queen. Poor Snow White wandered on alone, not knowing where to seek shelter. Toward evening she spied a little cottage and went in to rest herself. Everything about the cottage was small, but very neat and clean. On the table was spread a white cloth, and there were 7 little plates, 7 forks, 7 little knives, 7 little spoons, and 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds. As she was very hungry, Snow White ate and drank, taking a little from each plate so as not to eat up all the food from any one. After that, she thought she would lie down, so she tried each of the little beds. One was too long, and another too short, another too hard, and another too soft. But at last the 7th suited her, and she lay down and fell fast asleep. Presently the masters of the cottage came home. They were 7 little dwarves who worked in the mountains digging gold. They lighted their 7 lamps and saw immediately that all was not right. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my stool?" The second, "Who has been eating from my plate?" The third, "Who has been nibbling my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been eating my porridge?" The 7th said, "Who has been drinking my milk?" Then the first one looked around and said, "Who has been lying on my bed?" The rest came running to see, and each in turn cried out that somebody had been on his bed. Then the 7th dwarf saw Snow White and called to his brothers to come quickly. They held their lamps high so that they could see better, and when they saw Snow White, they cried in one voice, "What a lovely child!" They were delighted with her beauty, and took care not to waken her. The 7th dwarf slept with his brothers, an hour with each, so that Snow White might sleep on undisturbed. In the morning Snow White awoke. At first she was afraid of the little men, but they were kind to her, and she soon overcame her fear and told them her story. Taking pity on her, the dwarves said that if she would keep the house in order, cook and wash for them, she could stay in the cottage, and they would take care of her. Snow White agreed. Every day the dwarves went out to do their work, seeking gold and silver in the mountains. Snow White remained at home, and every day the dwarves warned her, "The queen will soon find out where you are, so take care and let no one in." The queen, now that she thought Snow White was dead, believed that she was certainly the loveliest lady in the land. Going to her looking glass, she said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" The glass answered, "The magic mirror tells you true, Snow White is lovelier than you. She's living still in Forest Glen, and dwells with 7 little men." Then the queen was mad with rage, for she knew that the mirror always spoke the truth. She knew that the huntsman had betrayed her. She could not bear to think that anyone lived who was more beautiful than she was, so she disguised herself as an old woman peddler and went over to the hills to the place where the dwarves lived. She knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell!" Snow White looked out the window and said, "Good morning, good morning. What have you to sell?" "Good wares, fine wares," the old woman answered. "Laces and ribbons of all colors." "I'll let the old lady in," thought Snow White. "She seems to be an honest soul." So she unbolted the door. "Bless me," said the old woman, "how loosely your bodice fits. Let me lace it with one of my new laces." Snow White did not dream of any harm coming to her, and she let the old woman do as she wished. She pulled the lacing so tight that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as though she were dead. "That will put an end to all your beauty," said the spiteful queen, and hurried away. When the dwarves returned home that evening, they were grieved to see Snow White stretched out on the floor, motionless. They lifted her up, and when they found the trouble, they cut the lacing. In a short while she began to breathe, and soon came to life again. Then the dwarves said, "The old woman was the queen herself. Be more careful next time, and do not let anyone in while we are away." When the queen got home, she went straight to her mirror and spoke to it as usual. To her great surprise, it said, "The magic mirror tells you true. Snow White is lovelier than you. She's living still in Forest Glen, and dwells with 7 little men." The queen was furious when she heard this, and dressed herself in a different disguise. She poisoned a comb and started again for the dwarf's cottage. When she reached there, she knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell!" Snow White called out, "I dare not let anyone in." Then the queen said, "As you like, but just look at my beautiful combs." Then she took the poisoned comb and gave it to Snow White. It looked so pretty that she took it and put it in her hair just to try it. But the minute it touched her head, she fell down senseless. By good luck, the dwarves returned early that evening, and when they saw Snow White lying on the floor, they could guess who had been there. They found the poisoned comb, and they took it away, and when they took it away, she recovered. They warned her once more not to open the door to anyone. Meanwhile, the queen went home to her mirror, and trembled with rage when it still told her that Snow White lived. Then she said, "Snow White will die if it costs me my life." She secretly prepared an apple. One side of it was poisoned. Whoever tasted it was sure to die. The other side of the apple was harmless. Then the queen dressed herself as a peasant's wife, traveled over the hills to the dwarf's cottage, and knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out the window and said, "I dare not let anyone in, for I promised the dwarfs." "Do as you please," said the woman, "but at any rate, take this pretty apple. I shall give it to you as a present." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take it." "You silly girl," answered the woman, "what are you afraid of? Do you think it is poisoned? Come, you eat one half, and I'll eat the other." Snow White was tempted to taste it, for the apple looked ripe and juicy, and when she saw the woman bite into it, she too took a bite. She had scarcely put the piece into her mouth when she fell down upon the floor. "This time nothing will save you," muttered the queen. She went home to her mirror and asked the usual question, and the mirror answered, "The magic mirror tells you true. The fattest in the land is you." Then her envious heart was glad, for she feared Snow White no more. When the dwarfs returned, they found Snow White lying on the floor. No breath passed her lips, and they were afraid that she was dead. They lifted her up, combed her hair, washed her face with wine and water, but all was in vain. Snow White did not move. They laid her on her bed, and all 7 watched over her for 3 days. She looked so lifelike that they put her in a glass coffin so that they might still look at her. They wrote her name on it in gold and placed it on the hill, and one of the dwarves always sat by it and watched. Thus Snow White lay for a long, long time, still looking as though she were asleep. At last a prince came through the woods and saw Snow White. He fell in love with her at sight and begged the dwarves to give him to her. Then he offered the dwarves money and earnestly prayed them to let him take her with him. But they said, "We shall not part with her for all the gold in the world." At last, however, they took pity on him and consented. He called his servants to lift the coffin, and in doing so one stumbled and fell. This jolt knocked the piece of apple from Snow White's mouth, and she awakened, crying out, "Where am I?" The prince answered, "You are safe with me." Then, telling her what had happened, he said, "I love you better than all the world, Snow White." Snow White was pleased. "No, I love you better than all the world. Snow White, please come to my father's palace and be my bride." Snow White consented and went home with the prince. His parents loved her at once, and everything was prepared for their wedding with great pomp and splendor. Among the rest, Snow White's old enemy, the wicked queen, was invited to the feast. As she was dressed herself in fine rich clothes, she looked in her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" And the glass answered, "The magic mirror tells you true. The bride is lovelier than you." When she heard this, the queen turned red with rage, but her envy and curiosity were so great that she could not resist going to see the bride. When she saw that it was no other than Snow White, who she thought had been dead for a long time, she choked with passion, fell in a fit, and died. But Snow White and the prince lived long and reigned happily over their land for many, many years. The end.